Hey everyone, it's John Heath here again for MiltonRose Learning with another Let's Learn video on the European powder keg for World War One. So today we are very much looking at the start of World War One, at the causes and what drove the conflict and how it actually came to be. Okay, so we're going to look at the key context and some of the causes kind of driving the onset of this imminent war. Then we'll have a look at a really nice chronology and historical events, which will just give you the core of the notes of what was happening in this period of history. And then we will break down the tertiary, secondary and primary significance of these events and kind of what they led to in the kind of march onto to the start of the Great War. Okay, so it should be a really, really interesting lesson. I've been really looking forward to this. So first off then, we have the context and the causes. So what was driving this imminent conflict, what we call the European powder keg, which just needed a spark to set it off? Well, first off then, there's four kind of things in my mind that are driving it. And the first one is imperial rivalries and what we call the scramble for Africa. So we can kind of see that the civilized nations of Europe were sending their explorers everywhere looking for resources, kind of like this in the little video, just so you can kind of see. But they were sending their explorers kind of all over Africa, the hunt for resources, as the video shows. So let's zoom in a little bit on it. So imperial rivalries then. So first off, the scramble for Africa was European powers competing extremely fiercely for overseas empires, resources and global influence. We're talking Germany, or Imperial Germany in this period. We're talking Britain and its empire, and we're talking France, primarily with Russia thrown in as well, but not necessarily into Africa as much. So the scramble for Africa was driving this rivalry. Also, we have the Moroccan crises. So German challenges to French control in North Africa was heightening international tensions and mistrust. The French and the Germans in this period loathed each other's guts, to be honest, and Germany was trying to challenge, and they were using Morocco as a bit of a proxy battleground for testing French resolve. Also colonial friction, so imperial ambitions, so empire building in this period, was creating constant friction and, as we can see there, was leading to diplomatic clashes between the great powers. So they were starting to kind of have big friction, as they were trying to carve out these empires, and that was driving the onset of the potential for World War One to break out. Then we have number two, there was a naval and military arms race going on. Okay, so basically Britain built something and then Germany tried to keep up, and then Britain built something and Germany tried to keep up again. So basically there was a big arms race dynamic. So it's symbolized in one of those ships, as you can see in the image there, the Dreadnought competition. So Anglo-German Naval Race sparked an very expensive contest to build revolutionary battleships called Dreadnoughts. Okay, these big monster ships, as you can see there. So when Britain kind of builds Dreadnoughts, then Germany tries to keep up, and it goes on and on and on with bigger guns, thicker armour and all these kinds of things. So they're trying to outdo each other militarily. That's driving militarisation, obviously. Expanding armies as well. So European nations were expanding their standing armies, and they were drafting aggressive, time-sensitive mobilisation plans. So for instance, we may have, France might draw up a mobilisation plan to have all the French army, millions of men, ready on the front lines in 6 weeks, for instance. Now when Germany realises that, then they're like, oh, well, we've got to do it even quicker. So these mobilisation plans were not creating much sense of security between, in the years running up to World War One. It was kind of building in this tension. Also, militaristic ideology. So European leaders were increasingly viewed war as inevitable. They were starting to almost sleepwalk into war, as some people were saying at the time. And they were starting to prepare their populations for conflict. So a kind of militaristic mindset was starting to take hold in the nation's capitals within Europe. So a real kind of toxic mix here. Then what else was driving it? Well, as we can see there, the alliance system was not helpful either, as we can see in that image. So we have two armed camps which are starting to kind of come together. So we have the Triple Alliance, Germany, Imperial Germany, Austria-Hungary next door, and Italy. They formed a defensive military pact to protect their mutual interests. And that was joined by, on the other side, the Triple Entente. So that was another military alliance. That was Britain, France and Russia to counterbalance the Triple Alliance. So you have these two massive armed blocks that are eyeballing each other constantly and just waiting to fight. Okay, it was looking very, very kind of edgy. So there was a structural element to this, to the coming of World War I as well. And the chain reaction, in the entangling treaties between these kind of these two forces meant a conflict between two nations may kind of threaten to drag the whole continent into war, because if you attack one of them, then they pull in all their friends from the alliance, and then before you know it, everybody's trying to kill everybody else. So it was a real kind of chain reaction. You know, it was again very, very toxic in that sense. Then we have a bit of a flashpoint in Europe of Balkan instability. Okay, so first off, Slavic nationalism. So that Serbs were extremely kind of nationalistic, and they didn't want to, you know, be taken over by Austria-Hungary. They wanted to unite Balkan Slavs to, and that threatened the multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, who were absolutely terrified of the Serbs kind of breaking away, because then their empire might break apart, and they didn't want that. Also, as the image says there, you have the decline of the Ottoman Empire as well in Turkey. So the collapse of Ottoman power really creates a dangerous power vacuum in Southeast Europe, because they used to rule that as part of their empire, but they were starting to lose control of it. And the Ottoman Empire was very famously called the sick man of Europe. Okay, it was seen as like a declining empire, and they could no longer keep control. And then it all kind of feeds into what we call the powder keg. So there's local Balkan wars in this period, and Russian support for Serbia made the region Europe's most volatile flashpoint. Okay, so when we pull back from that, you can see there was a lot of drivers here driving the coming of this war. Okay, and they were all interlocking and all kind of interleaving with each other. Okay, so a lot to get your head around there. Then moving forward, let's focus on a nice chronology at the top, and then at the bottom we'll focus on a turning point. Okay, so with the chronology, obviously we always want to start at the start. And again, these are really good quality notes for your classwork. Okay, so first off then, 1879 to 1907, we have the formation of those alliances we were just talking about. So Europe starts to split apart. So Germany links with Austria-Hungary in 1879, and then Italy 1882, and then over time the Triple Alliance starts to form. As you can see in that picture, they're kind of in the centre of Europe. There is an encircling threat, or as they see it, in the Triple Alliance. So France and Russia countered with the Dual Alliance 1894. And then that's joined by Britain, because we always tend to come late to alliances, and in 1907 to form the Triple Entente. Okay, so you can see those two alliance blocks come together. And the pacts that bind them entangle these countries together. So strategic fears turn any local border dispute into a potential full-scale European war. Because if you attack one of them, like, I don't know, you have a nibble at Austria-Hungary, for instance, then they call their friend Germany, and then they call their friend Italy, and then before you know it, you're fighting everybody. So those alliances at the start really kind of started this off. Then number two, kind of feeding into some of the themes that we've kind of mentioned there, and you've got Kaiser Wilhelm, the German kind of head of state there, looking very very regal in his death's head kind of cap. So 1898 to 1912, we have the Anglo-German Naval Race, so a little bit more detail here. So the Dreadnoughts that we learnt about before. So Britain launches HMS Dreadnought in 1906, and it renders older battleships obsolete because it has massive guns, much thicker armour, and it's very quick on the ocean. So all other battleships now are kind of pointless. And it sparks then a high stakes arms race because Germany's like, we can't have this. So they start building their own Dreadnoughts, and before we know it, they're increasing in number massively. Then we have the Kaiser's ambition, so Kaiser Wilhelm there. Germany passed naval laws to build a fleet capable of challenging the Royal Navy's dominance, okay? And Britain in this period had an empire all over the world, and so they needed, the Royal Navy needed to be the strongest navy in the world to keep that empire kind of ticking over. And Germany was challenging that. So obviously that was always, the Kaiser's ambitions there were always going to trigger political antagonism from Britain. They were always going to push back at that. And so the British reaction to that is they intensified warship production, because that's what we do. So, and they also strengthened informal military ties with France because they knew that France hated Germany. So there was always going to be a steady ally there. So it's starting to lock in with the dates. Let's look at number 3 as the prelude to the war gets going. So we have 1905 and 1911, the Moroccan crises. So the Kaiser's challenge then. So Germany attempts to block French influence in Morocco to test and to hopefully break the Anglo-French Entente. Okay, so they start pushing at the boundaries of their alliance. And the Agadir gunboat in 1911. So Germany sends the warship Panther, which you can see an image of there, to Agadir. But it backfires because it unites Britain and France against German aggression. So it doesn't split the alliance. If anything, it pulls Britain and France and the Entente together. Okay, but nevertheless, Kaiser Wilhelm was pushing at the boundaries, wasn't he? He was trying to split Britain and France there. And it leads to a diplomatic defeat. Germany was humiliated and forced to accept French control over Morocco, but it deepened Wilhelm's national resentment, and he's like, I'm going to get you back. And you can see, obviously, only 3 years later, World War I does break out. So he was pushing at the boundaries, and one thing with the Kaiser, he did not like to be humiliated. So he was always going to come back stronger. And then the last thing on the timeline for today is just 1908 to 1913. We have the Balkan Wars and the Crisis. So there's a Bosnian annexation in 1908, which is basically where you seize a bit of land and say, that's mine. So Austria-Hungary seized Bosnia, and that infuriated Serbia and drove Russia to prepare for future confrontation, because the Russians ethnically are very close to the Serbs and Bosnians and basically Slav people. And Russia basically was like, no, we're going to defend them. So they started preparing for war frantically. Also, there was conflicts in the Balkans in that area. So regional wars were ousting Ottoman power because we know the Turks were getting weaker. And that doubled Serbia's territorial size and their military confidence. They started to think, we can start pushing here and we might be able to challenge the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And a near-war footing, Austria-Hungary becomes determined to crush Serbia before Slavic nationalism tore its empire apart, because Austria-Hungary as an empire, it had loads of different races in it, and the Austro-Hungarians were very scared of the different ethnicities wanting independence, and then it would tear their empire apart. So they would not let Serbia kind of challenge them in any way, because then it might be the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Okay. So that gives you a very nice little quick chronology, just so we know some of the key events in this drama. But as we know, history is all about turning points. Okay, and we're just going to have a look at that. And we spoke about gunboat diplomacy and these terrible dreadnoughts, and you can just see kind of one here, so you can visualise it. They were monsters at sea, they really were. See, these were very, very strong ships. So a turning point in the coming of World War I for me is the naval arms race and the Agadir crisis, which we just kind of touched on. So there's a point of no return. Germany's aggressive naval expansion and gunboat diplomacy permanently cemented Britain's military alignment with France, because they were like, we can never be friends with Germany, so we're going to need to be friends with France now. Division of responsibilities. So Britain agreed to protect the English Channel whilst France secured the Mediterranean, effectively committing Britain to war if France was attacked. Okay, because if we didn't do anything, then the alliance stands for nothing, but also as well we would lose control of the Mediterranean, which we needed to reach parts of our empire. Also, the psychological shift as well. It transformed European diplomacy from what was called the Concert of Europe, which was managing peaceful crises, to actively preparing now for an almost inevitable total war. We were just like, oh, we're just going to end up trying to kill each other, so let's just prepare as best we can for it. So that mental shift as well. And for me, that was a turning point in this period. Now, with all of those events, the arms races and Kaiser Wilhelm going kind of crazy with Morocco and things like that, and the alliance systems, what was the significance of all of those events for the coming of the war? Well, there's always, I tend to, when I'm teaching history, I always tend to break it down into three. You've got tertiary significance, which is the least significant, secondary significant, kind of in the middle, and primary significance, which are the really important ones driving it. So let's step up. We'll start with tertiary ones first. What were the significant kind of things or consequences from the events that we've shown? Well, long-term geopolitical realignment. So it was the end of splendid isolation for Britain. It forced us to abandon non-intervention and tie our security directly to continental Europe. If a war broke out in Europe, we had to get involved. We couldn't just sit on the sidelines. Okay, so it changed our geopolitical perspective on Europe. Balkan instability, so it created a volatile, very volatile powder keg conditions in the Balkans, which obviously in our next lessons we will pick up on, because that's where the war pretty much kicked off and started. And it also started the long, painful erosion of empires. It accelerated the internal decline of the multi-ethnic Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian empires. They were already starting to lose grip before the war even started. Okay, so they were desperately scrabbling for allies to try and stay together. Then, in terms of slightly more significant, secondary significance kind of events, the domestic and imperial militarisation. So naval and arms strain became very heavy here. So heavy military spending forced governments to raise taxes in most of the industrialised nations, and it fueled domestic political tension because the people were starting to get very, very annoyed at having to pay taxes so you can buy loads of dreadnoughts. The global reach as well, the imperial rivalries started to get more intense, and it ensured that any European war would automatically pull in African, Asian, Pacific colonies, because this was always going to be a kind of a total war, dare I say. Okay, so it was always going to kind of get quite intense. The globalisation was locking in now. Public expectations, so constant war propaganda conditioned European populations to view a major conflict as inevitable and even heroic. This will be a great conflict, you know, we'll defeat those Germans and we'll come back as heroes before Christmas. We were being fed a kind of narrative already to kind of militarise the public ready for this conflict. But what was the most important significance? Well, for me, it's kind of symbolised in this picture, because diplomacy kind of finished, and then we were signing alliances like here, which were entangling us in any conflict. And you can kind of see, once those alliances are signed, that's it. Okay, we are bound then to defend our allies. So if anybody is attacked, it's pretty much all over. It's just going to be a free-for-all conflict, isn't it? So I think in terms of primary significance, I think there was an irreparable breakdown of diplomacy. These two permanent blocs became entrenched, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, as we know. Mediation becomes virtually impossible now because we're too armed like gangs looking at each other. Mobilisation triggers as well, so military plans such as the famous Schlieffen Plan, which we will talk about in another lesson, became tied to railway timetables, and it just made war almost inevitable. The orders were pretty much already written, and there was a massive danger now of escalation. It transformed even the slightest European dispute could be turned into like an existential threat for these major powers. If you just poke me in the eye, for instance, then I could go and get all of my friends in the alliance, and we'll come back and try and kill you. It was escalating out of control here, and I think that's these two armed blocks, for me, that's the most primary significance of all of these events. Okay, primary consequences, I mean. And there you go. That is a bit of a whistle-stop tour behind some of the causes and consequences of what was driving the onset of World War I just before it started. Okay, and we'll obviously be picking up the conflict when it begins in subsequent lessons. Okay, so hopefully you've enjoyed that. It's World War I is always a fascinating historical topic. Don't forget to hit the like, subscribe and tap the bell icon to never miss another Let's Learn video again. If you have anything that you'd like to kind of discuss about World War I, please do pop it in the comments, and we'll always do our best to kind of reply. It just remains to say, keep an eye out for our next World War I videos, of course. Hopefully you've enjoyed that. Take care, and we'll see you soon.